Hey, welcome. This week we're going to talk about a number of things that don't necessarily go together, but nevertheless are going to make up this module. The first of which is managing the environment. And this is somebody's going to come to you at some point when you're supposed to give a speech, and they're going to say, hey, how do you want the room set up? And you're going to have to know like what factors go into picking out which room setup you want and why. And if you don't know, you're probably just going to get however the room was set up for the last person, and it may or may not be a good thing for you. The second thing that we're going to talk about is relates to your persuasive presentations, and it has to do with it's going to be Simon Sinek's TED Talk, Start With Why. And it is a riff on what we learned about last week with rhetoric, and so credibility, ethos, pathos, and whatnot. And so if those seem like really abstract things, he breaks it down into a sort of a different model that hopefully you can understand and get your mind around a little bit better in terms of whenever I deliver my persuasive talk, how do I really appeal to the way that people make emotions or make decisions and whatnot. So hopefully that'll make some good sense for you. And then finally, if as well as part of your persuasive talk, you're going to be giving you're going to be telling a story as part of that talk, which I hope that you will, because storytelling is a good technique. We're going to talk about 4 sort of storytelling styles. So that'll be good. All of them are pretty short videos. So good. I always say every year that I'm going to change this PowerPoint because it's terrible. And it it reminds me of those terrible ads on TV from the 80s for law offices, this, can you just see it? It pops up, there's terrible animation. Do you have mesothelioma? Those kinds of things. But every year I don't, because it always makes me laugh. So cool. Well, let's talk first about managing the environment. So there's 5 factors to consider whenever you're taking into account how you want your room set up for your talk. The first one is what type of presentation, right? Because the way that you give a persuasive talk to a large group of people is different from the way that you would, give your training demo or some kind of facilitation or an informational. Those have different purposes and different, intents, and so you set up the room differently. The other thing is the size of the audience. It'll determine a little bit what you're able to do. The other one is the group's formality, right? So it's different to talk to a group of board of directors versus middle school FFA kids, right? So what did they expect? The other is the size of the room, what physical space do you have to work with? And then finally, the most important one, in my mind anyway, is how do you want the audience to interact with you and with each other? And so just as an example, the audience experience and what they're set up for in terms of expectations is vastly different if they come in and they sit in an auditorium with bolted down seats and they're facing a stage. They have a different expectation than if they come into a room with banquet style seating where everybody's sitting around a table of 6 and they're all looking at one another. Because in the latter one, I'm thinking, I'm supposed to talk to these people, or at least I should talk to them because they're all looking at me. Whereas in the other, you can sit quietly and wait for the speaker. So cool. So let's work through these. Here's the first one, and it's called theater style. You can see there some gold little circles representing the people and chairs and whatnot. Refreshments are served in the back. Get excited. And then, displays of just random stuff. Maybe it's giveaways, whatnot. And then the presenter, stands up front, off to the side, or in front of the screen if the screen's pretty high up. So this is good for persuasive style talks, right? Where it's just you kind of delivering a message. It doesn't require a lot of stuff for the audience to have to do to respond to you. It is good for kind of all sizes. This could be, a group of 10 or 12, or it could be, 5,000 people. This setup, works for all of those. It can be very formal, right? Because you feel like you have to sit there and look forward and not talk to the people around you. But it can also be in a lunchroom too. So part of the issue of formality is more what your group expects. And so if you have this setup and the chairs are nice, maybe it'll lend itself to more formalness than if it's this same setup in a high school cafeteria. So anyway, this is good for any size of room really, because you can get around pretty good. And then finally, for audience interaction, in this one, there's not good audience interaction, right? Like, because if you were to try to, break out in groups, it's really tough for them to, to talk to anybody other than the person on their left and their right. So maybe they can, get creative and turn around in their chairs or something, but by and large, not good for group interaction, and not particularly good for group interaction, like for interaction with you as the speaker either, right? Because imagine like you want to talk to somebody, you can really only talk to people that are either on the aisleways or right down front. So anyhow, so those are advantages and disadvantages of the theater style. The next one is classroom style, which you should be familiar with because it's exactly like the place that you give your talks in lab. So this one's good because, the addition of tables says that we can do things with our hands. So perfect for training demos, right? Also okay for informational talks or like lectures where you would want to have them take notes or whatnot. Still not very good for them working and talking with each other, right? If that's the main thrust of the event, it's probably not like the greatest thing. Probably a little better than the other one. At least sometimes in this guy here, the chairs are even connected together with those little like tongue and groove things, so you can't even move them. At least in here, usually with tables, you can. So things to think about. The audience interaction is still, like, again, kind of minimal. So cool. Good. All right, let's move on to the next one. This one is just like this one, but it's angled. And I don't think there's any real difference, and I don't know why I made this slide. So the next one is so you can basically just disregard Chevron. The one thing that it does do is it really puts the emphasis on the presenter right down front, and it also frees up some space in the back. But it's not vastly different from classroom. All right, so the next one is this conference room style, right? And so this is good for if you're facilitating an event, right? So maybe you're giving a brief 10 or 15 minute spiel and then you're allowing people to talk to one another, right? Because this, table setup, and especially if it's closed off at the top and it's basically a big boardroom table, this is the way that people sit around whenever they want to make decisions, right? Like as a board of directors or as some kind of team, because they're looking at one another, not necessarily at you. And so they're going to want to talk to one another. And so this setup is great if you want to, give some information and then lead them in discussion of something, or if, you're supposed to give their presentation and then they're supposed to make some kind of verdict on you. But the idea here is that, the audience interaction, like amongst themselves, is pretty high in this guy. It's difficult to have this set up in a small room because it can get real crowded, so it's good to have that. This is also a more formal sort of approach, just because, again, anytime you see people around like a boardroom style table, it conveys some kind of weird gravity to the situation, right? Like, oh, we're all sitting around looking at each other. We're probably gonna have to make some serious decisions. So anyhow, just remember that this is an option that you can use. So finally, this is what we call team style, right? And so this is like the example that I used in the beginning. If you bring in a bunch of people and you set them around looking at each other, they're going to want to talk to one another. And so if your goal is for them to talk to one another and to, work on different things, and you're there as kind of a facilitator, this is the perfect setup. It does take a lot of physical space, and it does take a lot of space per person too, because of the way that it's situated. So, big rooms, smaller crowds, or, if you got a big crowd, then you just kind of have a ginormous room. So, but what it's great for is so for example, I gave a talk at a conference in Washington, D.C. like 2 summers ago. Yeah. And we gave them like, a 30-minute sort of spiel about, this topic, which happened to be lobbying. And then they were in their teams that they came to lobby in. And so we were like, all right, like now take 10 or 15 minutes and, work on, carving out your elevator speeches for your groups or something, like that. And so they were able to work on it in their teams, like with their flip chart paper. And then we had them share with the whole group, from table to table. And so that works great for teams. So those are your options. We'll go over them again. So team style, conference style, Chevron style, classroom style, and theater style. So, all have pluses and minuses, but all, options that you have that people will know if they say, how do you want to set up the room? You'd be like, oh, well, I'd like round tables so they can talk to one another. So hopefully this was helpful to you. Not rocket science, but, if you've never thought about it, you've never thought about it. So there you go. Thanks.